welcome to Some of Your Parts podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Betsy Greenleaf, premier pelvic health expert and women's wellness warrior. Join me as we discuss women's wellness topics and discuss tips and tricks with top elite health experts, and where you'll discover that you're greater than the sum of your parts. I'm so excited today. We are going to have nurse practitioner Cynthia Thurlow and intermittent fasting expert. And so everything you need to know about intermittent fasting, we're going to go over this today. So thank you so much, Cynthia, for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Betsy.
So how did you get into intermittent fasting?
It's the super sexy story of being a perimenopausal woman and really hitting the wall, doing all the wrong things. I was, still working as a nurse practitioner for a very large cardiology group in the Washington, D.C. area, had a lot of autonomy, which equates with a lot of stress. I had a husband who did a lot of international travel. I had, at the time, 2 young boys, and, I was probably not sleeping enough and certainly probably too low carb for my body. And so I hit that wall, the weight loss resistance wall that I had never really experienced. And it was really humbling, not only as a middle-aged woman, but also as a clinician, because if I couldn't figure out why I wasn't able to lose weight and why I was so tired and why my periods were ridiculously heavy, I kept thinking, well, it's no wonder all my patients are confused. So it initially started as an N of one. I had a colleague that had brought up intermittent fasting kind of tangentially, and I dove down this rabbit hole. I, read Jason Fung's book, and I love giving him credit for giving me the courage as a fellow licensed healthcare professional to try intermittent fasting. And I felt so much better so fast. I didn't lose weight initially. I always like to be clear about that, but I just felt so much better that I knew I was onto something. And then I started talking about intermittent fasting to anyone that was willing to listen, which included family, friends, patients, clients. And then it really became part of, who I am and what I stand for. And the whole concept of eating less often, as you can well imagine, my whole background's in ER medicine and cardiology. So what did I treat and address? Lifestyle related choices that people were making that were creating, chronic long-term disease states. And for me, I just felt like it was such a valuable strategy that, it would be a crime if I weren't talking about it more. And I can tell you, we've conditioned our patients on so many levels that they need to eat to stoke their metabolism, and breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And they need all these heart healthy grains. And I'll be the first person to say that a lot of what I used to tell my patients when I was a newbie nurse and a nurse practitioner was completely wrong. And so now I feel like it's a public health threat. And so we really need to be speaking about the concept of lifestyle as medicine. And so that's initially how I started. And then what got me to the point where I did a talk that went viral was, I'm an introvert. People are oftentimes surprised to know that. But in 2018, I said to my husband, I think I should challenge myself and do a TEDx. Like, that was a scary, yet also safe concept. And so my first talk was about perimenopause, super sexy topic. And around the time I accepted my first, I was offered my second. And I said to my husband, what do I know a lot about? And he was like, intermittent fasting. I was like, okay, the talk's about intermittent fasting. And that's as much thought as I put into it. And then obviously the rest is history, not realizing that prior to that second talk, I would spend 13 days in the hospital, and getting out of the hospital, delivering that talk was really to demonstrate to my kids that I was okay. But that was as much as I thought about it. It was like, checkbox, did the talks, I'm going to have a normal summer. And then my business kind of blew up. But intermittent fasting to me is really a strategy that is not new or novel, and certainly one that I think is really important for most of us to consider at specific times in our lifetime.
That brings up, I wasn't actually ever sure up until now what intermittent fasting was. I remember when I first heard it, I was like, well, what is that? How is that any different than like binge eating? Like, if I'm I pictured it as like I was starving and then eating and starving and eating. And I'm sure you hear that from people who don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. So what do you tell them?
It's as simple as saying you're eating less often. And there's nothing that equates fasting with starving. Fasting identifies a specific time period in which you are eating and a specific time period in which you are not eating. It is not starvation. It is not restriction in the sense that you're not eating. And I think that, given the fact, if you look at statistics, you look at research, the amount of food frequency, both sugar sweetened beverages and food that the average American is consuming, they're eating 6 to 10 times a day. Is it any wonder we're dealing with such rampant obesity? So, my suggestion to eat less often is really framed in science, and it's really framed in, a strategy that not just healthcare providers can do, but everyone else as well. There's very few people that shouldn't be able to intermittent fast. And obviously I do talk about that in the book. But the concept of binging, are there people who will binge eat when they break their fast? Yes. But it always goes back to this physiology. We have our reptilian brain, the amygdala, and then we have our, thinking side of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. And if your body perceives that it's not going to be fed, and that reptilian brain is concerned, it's like thinking about survival, it can override the prefrontal cortex. And so I tell people, break your fast earlier. Where are you in your menstrual cycle? It should never be that it provokes a binge unless you already have an existing distorted relationship with food. And then I think the most important thing is that you are working with someone that can help you manage those uncomfortable feelings and expectations, and then determine if fasting is actually appropriate for you. But when people tell me they binge, it's usually a sign that they fasted too long, or they're not fueling their bodies properly in their feeding window.
And then I've heard things like, oh, you have to do it where it's got to be like 14 hours of fasting and this many hours of eating, or it's got to be 16 hours. Is there a right and wrong way to do it when it comes to the time?
Well, I think a lot of it's dependent on what are your goals. I think that's clearly important. I would say, to bare minimum, we should all have 12 hours of digestive rest. Every single person out there, even my teenagers, I will tell them there's a period of time you should not be eating. Like, you don't need to be eating 24/7. And so if you're really looking at longevity research, if you're looking at, boosting autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process that goes on behind the scenes in an unfed state, longer is going to be better. But if you're really just looking for the benefits of less bloating, more digestive rest, 14, 15 hours can be absolutely fine. So I think it's really highly dependent on your goals. And then the other kind of caveat is, if you're already at a goal weight, you don't want to be over fasting. So I see a lot of people that are going to extremes. Obviously, if you have a lot of weight to lose, you have a lot of stored energy that your body can break down and utilize once you're metabolically flexible. But if you're already thin, like when I see these, BMI of 19 women that will fast for 3 and 4 days, I'm like, what are you doing? The law of diminishing returns in terms of the added incremental benefit is going to be so small. Like, I don't do really long fasts. I think it's because I spent 13 days not being able to eat, and that has left an indelible impression on my psyche. But with that being said, there are benefits to shorter fasts. There are benefits to longer fasts. I think it really is important for people to identify why they're fasting and, make adjustments there. And then also, connecting with people that are knowledgeable. Unfortunately, now everyone thinks they're an expert in this area, but there's certainly people I lean into in terms of, like, what's the research saying? What is realistic for you? For someone who works, I'll give an example, both you and I are licensed healthcare professionals. I have a lot of nurses and doctors who are fearful to fast. They're like, how do I do this around a shift? And if they're doing night shift, I'm like, eat before you go in. Don't eat overnight. Maybe you have some coffee or some tea. And then, when you get home in the morning, you decide if you need to eat then, or if not, you take a little bit of a nap and you go about your day. And I think we just have to recondition ourselves to understand that we don't need to be eating 6 to 10 times a day, that actually that is damaging to our metabolism and damaging to hormonal regulation in the body. And this is what people aren't talking about enough. I think we're still abiding by the calories in, calories out model. We're very fixated on eat less, exercise more, and our bodies are far more complex than that.
I'm just going to ask you a personal question because I am in menopause. I've been trying to lose weight forever, but I made the decision to intermittent fast without actually looking into how to do it. But for people, and obesity is a big problem in the United States. With the intermittent fasting, is it something where you're giving that this time period, and then are you eating the same amount of calories you would have eaten if you weren't fasting during that time period, or is the calorie count going down?
Well, I actually don't suggest to women or men for that matter, that they count calories. I'm more focused on macros, because when you hit the right amount of macros, especially protein, you're automatically going to hit the satiety signals in your brain that are going to tell you, okay, I've had enough food. So the first question is, one of the key benefits of intermittent fasting is there's some degree of caloric restriction. If you are going from eating, 3 meals a day and snacks in between to 2 larger meals a day, just by virtue of a compressed feeding window, you will be eating less calories. But again, that's not my area of focus. I think when we're talking about perimenopausal, menopausal women, there's so much to unpack. I always say, like, what's your sleep quality? Do you track your metrics? Like, do you have a Whoop band, an Oura ring? I'm a big fan of the Oura ring because I like to look at deep sleep and REM sleep, which we know is critically important. What's your stress management style? It's not 5 minutes of meditation once a week as a menopausal woman. Are you physically active? Like, I'm a huge proponent of women to strength train throughout their lifetime. Muscle is the organ of longevity. Thank you to Dr. Gabrielle Lyon for teaching that to me. Insulin resistance starts in our muscles. So you want to think about maintaining and building lean muscle mass, which does get harder in perimenopause and menopause, but is not impossible. And so the more muscle mass you have on your body, the more calories you're going to be able to burn effectively. And you're going to think of your muscles as a glucose reservoir. So sarcopenia, which is muscle loss with aging, is not a question of if, but when. And so we want to do all the things to work against it. I also think additionally about, that the protein macros, 100 grams of protein a day, if that's divided between 2 meals, you're not going to be hungry to consider eating more food because your satiety signals, all those hormones are going to be, ideally, when you're metabolically flexible, are going to be able to let your brain know that you're completely full. So when I look at perimenopausal, menopausal women, obviously these are unique circumstances. The lifestyle piece is really, really important. And your relationship with carbohydrates. Like I always say, if you have a piece of meat, like a ribeye that already has healthy fats in it, you don't need more fats added to your meal. But if you have like a piece of filet, you're having a piece of cod, you're having a piece of chicken breast that tends to have less fat in it. Maybe you have olive oil in a salad. Maybe you have some nuts, a portion, a serving. And then your relationship with carbohydrates has to change. And this is sometimes a source of frustration. I always ask women to examine their relationship with alcohol. Alcohol is a toxin. It does suppress, your REM and your deep sleep, dysregulates cortisol, does a lot of things that can impact sleep quality. And then also the other piece is, with carbohydrates, a whole food source carbohydrate, like a sweet potato, non-starchy vegetables, is going to be superior than a processed carbohydrate, bread, pasta, etc. And I really encourage women in particular to wear a continuous glucose monitor or use a glucometer so that you can get an idea of what your carbohydrate threshold is. So if you have 25, 50 pounds to lose, you have to reduce your carbohydrate intake. You really do. And the average American is consuming 200 to 300 grams of carbs a day. It's really important to understand that you may need to get under 100, under 75 total, not total grams of carbohydrate, not net. Net is a cheat. And I'll be the first person to say the processed food industry tries to make us feel better about eating processed foods by saying, oh, because of the fiber, we can cheat and fudge the numbers. So looking at all those variables is very, very helpful. And I'm very outspoken about this, that you cannot fast and not be thinking about these other variables, especially as a middle-aged woman, because weight loss resistance can be from 15 different factors. But I find for the average woman, it's sleep quality, it's their nutrition that needs to get dialed in, it's their stress management style. Most women are still doing chronic cardio and not doing any weight training. And I tell them all the time, like, there are women all across social media that are in their 60s, 70s, look amazing. And what do? They're lifting weights. You are capable of doing that, even with the fluctuations in sex hormones that are happening as we make that transition.
These are such amazing points. I was thinking too about, like, what as humans did we evolve to do? And so intermittent fasting makes sense because, as cave women, we weren't walking across the savannah and open our refrigerator every 2 seconds, So what are the other health benefits that intermittent fasting gives us, which is what we should be doing because this is what we evolved to do?
Exactly. It really dates back to biblical times. I remind everyone that fasting is incorporated in all the major religions. So number one, I just think about the fact you have improved mental clarity and more energy. And this is a byproduct of being able to break down certain types of fats, which are ketones. One in particular, beta hydroxybutyrate, diffuses across the blood-brain barrier. Our brains love fat, despite what people want us to think otherwise. So that is going to definitely help with energy, mental clarity. When your insulin levels are low in a fasted state, you are also going to, as a byproduct, you are going to be much more mentally clear. And this was probably the first or second, significant improvement I felt when I was in a fasted state. I think about things I already mentioned, autophagy. So it's like your body is taking out the garbage, and this gets upregulated in a fasted state. Our body can remove disease, disordered organelles, mitochondria, things that don't belong, potentially precancerous cells. We also get improvement in our biophysical markers, so blood pressure, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL. It lowers our risk of developing neurocognitive disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's dementia. And I think it's important for women to understand, like, our risk of developing Alzheimer's really becomes problematic in menopause. And a lot of it is related to the loss of estradiol signaling in the brain, but also progesterone and testosterone. And then I also think about a lowered risk of certain types of cancers, as well as improvement in the gut microbiome and reductions in inflammation and oxidative stress. And not all inflammation is bad, but chronic inflammation is certainly a huge issue. But those are generally like the key high points. The other thing that I would mention is that people come to intermittent fasting because they want to change body composition, they want to lose weight. But I always remind them there's so much more to it than that, that there are many people who will patiently go several months without losing weight, and they're frustrated, but then they start feeling so much better. They feel very committed to staying the course.
And you have a book that recently came out. What is the name of your book, and where can we find it?
Yeah, so it's Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45. So yeah, we've had some really amazing success with the book. It's really resonated with people, which makes me feel very grateful. But you can find this on Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble, or your local bookstore. And I always encourage people to go to a brick and mortar business if at all possible. A lot of our small businesses have really suffered over the last 2 years with the pandemic. But yeah, it's super exciting. It's a book I wish I had, quite honestly, when I was starting to go into perimenopause, and certainly the book that really applies to women under 35, 35 to 50, and 50 and beyond. There's ways to fast effectively based on where you are in your menstrual cycle and life stage.
Where else can people find out information about you?
Yeah, probably easiest to start with my website. So it's www.cynthiathurlow.com. I have an amazing podcast called Everyday Wellness, and Dr. Betsy will be on later this summer. I'm on Amazon. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter, where, be forewarned, I can be snarky depending on the day. I have a free Facebook group called Intermittent Lifestyle / my name. That it applies to both men and women. So we have all different genders. It's a very inclusive, happy, positive place. I'm anti-drama. In fact, I am so anti-drama. But on my website, it's probably the easiest way to kind of connect with all those avenues. And then we will have some intermittent fasting classes starting in September, probably around the time this podcast will come out.
This is wonderful. You're doing such amazing work in the world. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about this.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I want to just remind everybody, make sure you go check out Cynthia and all her sites. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Today's episode was brought to you by the Pelvic Floor Store, your source for personal health. You can find us at www.pelvicfloorstore.com. For more information on today's episode and women's wellness, please go to drbetsygreenleaf.com.